welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio, Carnivore Bites. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. And you talk about, items in the news. This one's, right front and center, and that's the Supreme Court nominee, Ms. Jackson. And stark contrast between Trump's two nominees, which is essentially a left-wing freak show versus the civility or overall civility of this hearing.
Yeah.
And before you get into, I have something. As I just said that, I'd love, and I'm sure our listeners would. Does it have any political wings or traction?
Well, I think there's definitely political wings on here. Aside from showing just how rabid the left has become, the Republicans are hammering her on being soft on crime, and that's going to be a topic that comes up again and again as we get closer to November, that Democrats are soft on crime. The other thing that's really interesting is that Biden has been beating the drum about this being the first African American woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court, and that is actually not true. In 2003, Judge Janice Rogers Brown was on a short list for George Bush to nominate to the Supreme Court, and she never made it through hearings because Joe Biden on the Judicial Committee filibustered her.
Okay, why don't we know about that? That is groundbreaking, and that's one issue. The second issue, assuming that she was on the more the conservative side, is it really you're not Jewish, you're not black, unless you are liberal. If you're conservative, black, Jewish, Hispanic, then you're a creep like all the rest of them.
Basically, that's it. Even more than that, though, they held her back specifically because they did not want the Republicans to get credit for putting an African-American woman on the bench. Now, remember, Republicans are the ones that put Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman, on the bench.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans are the ones that put Clarence Thomas, the first African-American, on the bench.
Who was brutalized, by the way.
Oh, yeah. The Democrats did not want them to be the party that put the first African-American woman on the bench. So the Democrats sidelined her for their own political purposes.
Two takeaways I have from that. I'm sure there's more. First takeaway is, isn't it just reminiscent of the whole situation with Biden that he's just a political hack? He has no original thought. He's a product, a growth, an outgrowth of the swamp, of the Beltway. That's all he was. He always was, and he always is a political hack.
He is. And, I mean, his opposition to having an African-American woman on the bench was very public. He actually went on Face the Nation and stated that he would filibuster if this woman was nominated.
Okay. Free press in America. I mean, maybe that's like with Santa Claus and Tinkerbell and the Tooth Fairy, but why don't we know about this?
Yeah, why haven't they
That's
talked
really
about
gross
it?
negligence.
It really is. And, there's been a lot of talk about state-sponsored media in Russia and Ukraine. How is our media any different?
There's no difference. I mean, even jumping a story is you look at the Hunter Biden laptop from hell. New York Times just recently, or like now, has a Maya Copa on it. Oh, by the way, just a little interesting fact: 1 out of 6 individuals that were polled who voted for Biden potentially said they would have reconsidered knowing what this all entails. So, gee, you think there's a withholding of information? You think that might go against maybe a real free press? And aren't they just a wing of the Democratic Party? Hey, you release it now, who cares? Like, someone's dead, so you can tell that they were embezzling money. Who cares? At this point, it's a story, but it's half the story it could have been.
It clearly would have changed the election. And even now, where's the rest of the media? The New York Times basically buried this story. I mean, their story about what Hunter Biden is doing, appeared on page 20 of Section A, and you had to go 26 paragraphs down before they got to the fact that the laptop
Okay, the
was
only person
real.
that ever read that is someone who's retired or in prison, or
Yeah, it's,
both. Or yeah, way too much time on their hands. But yeah, it is troubling. You see what's going on, but you know what intrigues me, Doctor Lopkin, is in spite of the press clamping on stories and basically carrying the water until lately for Biden, um, he's really tanking. A recent poll that just came out, he's underwater 36%, but more importantly, he's got a horrible, horrific approval rating from independents of only 24%. That's hasta nuega in terms of an election.
it really is. And it's because Biden misread the polls and misread the election results. The left convinced him that they were the ones that got him elected. The fact of the matter is, they're not. It was
Trump got him
independent.
elected.
Well, it was independents that got
Hmm.
him elected because they wanted somebody who they thought was going to be a little saner than Trump. Turns out that's not what was happening. But they wanted a centrist. That was how he campaigned. And when he turned towards the left, as soon as he was elected, independents went, wait a minute, that's not what we voted for. That's not what we agreed to. And he's been kowtowing to the left because they convinced him that they're the ones that got him elected, but it's independents that got him elected, and it's independents that are going to take Congress away from the Democrats in November and keep him from getting a second term,
Yes,
assuming he
I don't
even
think a
runs.
second term is ever going to be in the cards. I think he's way too depleted for that. But speaking of depletion, I think that's one of the reasons why he can't adjust on the fly. We talked about Clinton, a darling of the left, when he was elected in '92, and then he had the ability because he was a smart guy, he was politically savvy. Could he adjusted on the fly? And in spite of, or besides the impeachment and Monica Lewinsky fiasco, he was a successful president. But this guy, Biden, I mean, does he really even know what day? He has no ability to formulate original idea. He's a bookmark.
That's pretty much it. And I mean, it's hysterical because Jen Psaki keeps using the term that the history will decide. We'll leave that to the history books. The history books are going to say Biden was a horrible president who may very well have presided over World War III.
Yeah, no, it's a very scary situation. You like him or not, Nixon. A lot of people don't like him, but he had the world respect. I believe. I'm sorry to say, Trump, comparatively so, had all the attention and the respect of world leaders. This guy's not. I mean, he's a buffoon. It's pathetic. It's like a
I mean,
bad B movie.
you literally have foreign leaders not taking his calls.
Yeah, and that's reminiscent of Obama when the Chinese didn't basically greet him at the airport. That's sending a clear signal. Yes, not respected. But speaking of not respected, and I think it's just a tip of the iceberg of incompetency throughout this. It's rampant through this administration. Mayorkas, the, the head of in charge of immigration, and a total buffoon challenging court rulings. I mean, this guy's talking about being beholden to the left. He's more interested in letting people in. He's clearly stated that's his mission, not preventing, but encouraging. And
Yeah,
again,
he's
Biden doesn't understand that that's one of the Achilles heel of this administration's people's outrage and what's going on at the border. But can he make adjustments? No.
and no, he refuses to make adjustments. And part of that, though, is I honestly believe he's looking at demographic research from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, where, African Americans voted reliably Democrat, Hispanics voted reliably Democrat. That's not the case anymore. Especially, I mean, African Americans are switching in fairly large numbers, but Hispanics are switching parties in droves primarily because of what's going on at the border, because these guys went through their paces, went through immigration law, to become citizens. And now they're going, well, wait a minute, these guys are just jumping the line.
They're jumping the line, but they're also being, I'll use the term resettled, which is another word for they want them voting next election.
All right. And that's why New York said, well, you know what? Illegal aliens can vote in New York City elections. That's absolutely ridiculous. And they're going to find it's against the state constitution of New York. So once that's going to go to court, and even the state judges are going to have to go, well, no, we have rules against this.
But isn't it really a bellwether that the Democratic Party is in panic zone? They've lost Middle America. They've lost U.S. Hispanics, U.S. African Americans. I'm talking citizens. So they're scrambling. It's like I'm not saying it's well thought out, but it's like any situation when you're in a panic, either in business or in your personal, you probably don't make the best. So what else do they got? They're losing everyone in droves. I mean, only
Yeah,
15% of this country is into the crap they're preaching, and half of those people are in insane asylums.
I think a big part of the problem is that the Democratic Party stopped listening to Americans and started listening to Twitter. And the fact of the matter is, what is on Twitter is a liberal echo chamber, uh, especially helped on by the fact that if you put conservative information on there, Twitter bans you.
Though I agree with that without any question. It's hard to argue with that, obviously, but I think it goes deeper and longer than that. I think the parties have switched. It's like having a railroad track when I was a kid. The train, you have a switching track. And I think they've done that, I would say maybe 8 years ago, something like that, during probably the Obama, that time period. I think, it was the Republicans that were the country clubs, big business. It's completely different now. And I think that's part of the reasons because the Pelosi's and Schumer, they're up in in the vineyard, in the Hamptons, eating sushi, having some Chardonnay. They don't even know how to spell America.
Actually, I'm going to go even further back than that. I don't think the Democrats were ever the party of the American people. Yes, they got into bed with the unions because they needed their support. But there was a conversation just earlier today. Jamie Dimon, the head of Goldman Sachs, and he's been head of Goldman Sachs for a while, has been a diehard Democrat for decades. They've always had Wall Street backing. I think it was just a matter of messaging. And now they've lost the message because after all of this time, all of the policies Obama put out that actually harmed rural America, that harmed minorities, that harmed the working class, they're starting to see, all right, you know what? These guys are not in our corner and they're backing away from the Democrats. So the Democrats are doubling down on left wing propaganda because they don't have anything left.
I would concur with that as well. I think it also can go, believe it or not, we don't need a history lesson, but go back to Nixon's silent majority, the roots of Vietnam, working class people, the people that fought in Vietnam being abandoned by the Democratic parties, the ones that got us into the war. I think that was, I would say, the beginning of this separation, but that's for another edition. Speaking of this, our esteemed president and his group there, we have Camilla and Joe having a little marital disagreement, and there's a book coming out that they're really not getting along that well together. In fact, Kamala's resenting him putting her in charge, or calling her the border czar. She thought that was unfair, so on and so forth. And I think on the flip side, he looks at her doing these word salads in Poland, and then recently she was talking at an internet conference or communications conference, and she went on. It reminded me of like days in college when it's like, okay, who's got the bong? Talking about on and on about the passage of time. I mean, she's a vice president. She's not a sorority sister. This is a joke.
Yeah, I think Dana Perino over on Fox actually, I think, phrased it best. She said it's like she was told she had to talk for 4 to 7 minutes, and she was just padding the speech to get to 7 minutes.
Absolutely. It's like being a teacher and you get tests in and students trying to pad, the number of pages, restating the question on the page just to
Yes.
fill. So yeah, exactly. She says she needs to get up there. She has no idea what she's talking about. So the passage of time and time passages, it's a brutal display. But interesting
And
enough, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
what I don't understand is, when Donald Trump went off script, he was a disaster. And when Biden goes off script, he's a disaster. And both of them have were basically told, look, here's the teleprompter, stick to what's on the teleprompter. Why is nobody reining in Harris and saying just read what's on the teleprompter?
I don't know. Maybe she's. I don't know. I wouldn't even go there. I will argue a little bit or push back a little bit. I think, yeah, when Trump went off teleprompter, he might have angered people because he ruffled feathers, went,
Yes.
misspoke, but no one questioned his competency. They might have questioned the direction, his thought, not his thought process, what he was talking about, his policy direction, but not his competency. And there's a big difference between
No,
Biden and Harris. When they
yeah,
talk, you're like, what
nobody
the hell
questions.
is going on?
Yeah, nobody questions Trump when he goes off
You
teleprompter.
might
And in fact,
disagree. Fair enough. Yes.
right. And in fact, just recently at an event, he riffed an hour and a half speech.
Which
And he
Biden couldn't riff for a minute without
no,
mumbling, stumbling, and all the above. But speaking of Trump, though, I think that crazy to say this, but I really am listening to more and more pundits and reading more information. I don't know if he's the foregone conclusion. There's a recent poll that came out that said he's 3 points ahead of Biden. Well, you can say that's really great, but my cat Carl polled 8 points ahead.
right, with
A
Biden's
dead
approval.
body did four.
With Biden's approval rating, anybody should be doing more than 3 points ahead. Trump is still an incredibly divisive figure, and the Republicans know that. And I honestly believe Trump has been the front runner so far, primarily because Republican pundits and Republican candidates have been very concerned about Trump followers not showing up for other candidates. But Glenn Youngkin in Virginia gave them the roadmap because he was endorsed by Trump, but he didn't campaign with Trump. He didn't talk about Trump. He made sure, despite the fact that the Democrats kept trying to make the campaign about Trump, he kept it on the issues. He got Trump voters to turn out. He got centrists to turn out. He even got some moderate Democrats to vote for him. So Youngkin gave them the blueprint on how to run these campaigns come November to keep the Trump followers in the party and not, splitting off to another Tea Party.
Yeah, but
And
isn't it also a point of that there's no one to compare or juxtapose Trump in terms of formally? Like if you had DeSantis out there campaigning, or someone else, a younger, someone without so much baggage but very articulate, very much on board with the America First agenda. I don't know if Trump's just a hollow vessel ready for implosion. I think the
I
latter.
I think what's going to happen, and it's way too early for anybody to be campaigning for 2024, but I think what you're going to see is the policies that Trump put forward are going to be adopted by other candidates. Now, we said this a number of times. Trump's message was great, but he was a terrible messenger.
No, his policies were
His
great. His messages were crazy.
No, no, no. His message about America first and how
Oh
we
yeah, no,
have
no, I
to,
agree. Okay, 100%. Yes,
yeah,
and
but
it
he
resonated. Yes.
right, but he was the wrong messenger. He was a terrible messenger for this. I think as other people are picking up on it, and you're going to see a lot of candidates pick up on that message because Biden walked into office, undid everything that Trump, put forward, and look at the disaster it caused.
I think some of
So
his handlers. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
all they have to do is go, well, yeah, look what happened under these policies and look what happened when Biden repealed them.
A hundred
So when
percent
you have
agreed.
so when you have other candidates with the message who are better messengers, you're going to see Trump is not going to be the flag bearer for the party.
The elephant in the room, though, is how do you diffuse Trump without him having a hissy fit? I mean, obviously, I'm sorry to say he's not the most mature individual, even though he's 75 or something of that nature. I mean, there's middle school students that have are more intact.
Yeah, I honestly think he will throw a hissy fit. He will, throw temper tantrums. But if the other candidates can go, look, we're your successors, we're taking your policies further, that may placate him a little bit. What's really going to be important is having more moderate and centrist Republicans turn out in the primaries. Because even if he whines about, fake news and he doesn't believe the polls or he doesn't believe the vote, if he doesn't win the primary, there's not a lot he can do.
Agreed. And one thing about marketing and reading the tea leaves, you can't just assume because a small group is saying one thing that that's how it is. But I will say, in my circle of political friends that basically are on the conservative side, every one of them said, "Yeah, same like you just said." Trump, his policies were fantastic. The overall message, his implementation he was a disaster, and so was his messaging in terms of the actual on the ground message. It was just a disaster, and everyone I talked to wants him to go away. He had his time. He lost to someone that's essentially a mental midget. It's time for you to go. You blew your chance.
Essentially, that's it. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Time's up, as they say. Now you have a very interesting story about the spying spy agencies looking into Project Veritas. In fact, the New York Times is basically and the ACLU taking Project Veritas's side, aren't they?
Yeah, it's not spying agencies, it's the Department of Justice that's doing this. Now, if you remember, flip the time machine back about 8 years. Under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice did this, and the FBI did this same thing to the Associated Press. So, this is, again, the Democrats weaponizing government against their political enemies. This time, however, Project Veritas is not going to be quiet about it. The ACLU has issued a statement in their defense. The New York Times is questioning the actions that were taken by the Southern District of New York against Veritas journalists. It You've seen the press go, all right, you know what? Enough is enough.
Well, speaking of enough is enough, Bill Maher, I used to watch him years ago. I enjoyed him. Uh, a noteworthy liberal had a really interesting quote, and it's funny. I mean, is his ideology starting to wane? Because he had a quote that he believes that the state of California, I don't concur with this, but it's at least a fantasy of mine. But his thought is that California will actually turn red. And here's his quote: "Because people can't do an effing thing around here."
Yeah, Bill Maher has been standing up to the Democrats, and I don't think his ideology has changed any. It's just that the Democratic Party went much further to the left than his ideology.
Which is
He's
pretty
he's a,
far left.
right. I mean, he's a liberal, but compared to the Squad and the Progressive Caucus, he's almost centrist. So
Exactly.
they
That's how
went
far things have
so
gone.
yeah, they went so far to the left that they've lost the Democratic base, which goes to what we were talking about earlier. The Democrats have essentially alienated their own people to the point that they've got no bench, they've got no credibility. And honestly, I think what really bothers me about it is that the Democrats let it go this far. Because let's face it, the progressives, most of them identify themselves as democratic socialists.
Hmm.
The head of the Progressive Caucus identifies herself with the Working Families Party. Even Bernie Sanders represents himself as an independent socialist, except when it's time for him to run for president, and then he rejoins the Democratic Party. So these are people who were not Democrats. They came in and hijacked the party. And I blame Schumer, I blame Pelosi, I blame the mainstream Democrats for allowing this to happen.
That's a point that anyone would find hard to argue with. I also think that again, it's sometimes it's just the fear factor. I think they were scared to death of being called out by AOC. Again, these people are old. They're all into their what Pelosi's into her 80s, Schumer's into his late 70s. I mean, they've lost the A game, so they're scared. And they're not used to this kind of pushback with AOC and the squad. And I think they were scared shitless, quite frankly. Something that
I
just go ahead.
I think they were scared, but you know what? Well, one, that's not an excuse,
I
but
know that.
two, they shouldn't have been scared because they saw this happening back in the 1980s after Carter's disastrous presidency, after um, the far left candidates that they put up against Nixon and who got blown away.
McGovern.
Well, McGovern, chief among them. The Democrats knew this was going to happen. That's why they put the superdelegates into play. They created the superdelegates exactly to stop Barack Obama from becoming president. And when the time came to pull the plug, they went, well, we didn't expect it to be an African American. If we use the superdelegates, we're going to be called racist. Well, then you got what you asked for, and the whole party shifted left because they refused to use the safety valve that they themselves put in.
Well said. Last thing, as we were on the air, a news flash just came my way that former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is dead at 84. Any thoughts on that? Obviously, we mourn
Ma-
anyone's passing. Yes.
yeah, Madeleine Albright was a trendsetter. She was one of the, honestly, I believe one of the most capable Secretary of States we've ever had. And it's really a shame that we have lost her. And, we talk a lot about ticking off boxes. Madeleine Albright gained her power with, not because they ticked off
Through
boxes, but
accomplishment.
yeah, because she was accomplished. She knew what she was doing. She stood up and did what needed to be done. And it didn't matter that she was a woman or a man or whatever. This was somebody that everybody in both parties respected. And that's what we need more of in Washington.
And didn't she get her inspiration from Kamala? Just kidding.
Oh, sure.
Anyway, well, it's another edition of Carnivore Bites. We'll be back next week, and I like the feature of listeners can contact us and
Yeah,
give their input.
if you'd like to make a comment on any of our stories or have something you'd like us to look into, you can reach us at xvadio.com/connect. You can hear this podcast as well as the rest of the Xvadio podcast network at xvadio.com/podcasts, Apple Podcast app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Audible, and wherever you find podcasts.
Thank you, Dr. Lopkin. Thank our listeners. Take care.
We'll see you next week.